Thank you. Welcome to the first, let's say, this part of the discussion. I think we will already slightly move into the more broader discussion. So I think it seems kind of an exercise in thinking and speaking at the same time. After 6 very powerful and intense presentations. So one thing is for sure clear, cultural work needs time to be explored. So when we look at the kind of overarching topic of the conference, where are we now and what do we do here in the now? So I think there is, and I'm quoting the quote from Gramsci from Natasha, I mean, there is maybe still a pessimistic intellect about our times, but there is an enormous curatorial will, enormous optimistic curatorial will to answer these times, also artistic practices. So from what we could see from your presentations, and I think that's the good news. So the difficult news is now how we bring this all together in a discussion. So I thought maybe starting also with which was mentioned before, that this is of course still a privilege that we do what we do. And so that there is also a responsibility in that what we do, which comes, of course, with a privilege. And what struck me is like, I mean, there's 2 things which I kindly would like to draw more as a kind of provocation. And then a question which is more related to all of your practice, which is very international. So that means that there is, for me, an understanding of there is a very much new confidence, regional confidence coming from all these practices and from all these, let's say, analysis of artistic works and also showing them in exhibitions or kind of referring to them as public gestures, as you did, which then of course changes the role of the curator very much. But how this kind of comes into an international practice, which is still, of course, happening very much in Western centers. So if you look at the Biennales, if you look at Paris, like Venice, Paris, or maybe not so much Casablanca, but it would be then a question how Biennale in Casablanca is informed by that. But the other thing is that, start first with my question is more, what intrigued me is that there's a lot of going back into histories. And what does it mean when we go back into histories? Some of these are marginalized histories, some are histories that had to be discovered or were undiscovered so far. Some of these histories made it all the way through to, let's say, large-scale exhibitions like Documenta. If you look at and it was mentioned before, at this year's Documenta, so how, for example, indigenous art came up, or the question of indigenous knowledge at this year's Documenta. So, and what you said, so we don't speak about capitalism anymore. No, we all learn now from the global south. So what does this mean actually? Or is it just another way of kind of a capitulation maybe? So we don't say capitalism anymore, but now we say south. So, so just maybe, I mean, we all know we have these kind of urgencies in the art world, and then we follow them, but what does that mean? Because I think they come from a very different perspective. How do we start? So my question is actually what it means to discover these marginalized histories. That's my first question. Bringing them into kind of a publicness. While at the same time, and I think it's very interesting from Paris what you've said before, because the way when you were studying there and missing this out, where we now see a generation who found its own spaces in Paris, like Kader Attia with La Colonie, so where they don't actually need the white space anymore, they kind of found their own spaces, or Savi Contemporary in Berlin, so they kind of reclaimed the space. So, and of course still tell stories we don't know, or maybe haven't discovered yet, but still not in the, let's say, more hegemonic spaces. So, and I think there is a relationship, which I would be interested how you see this from your curatorial perspectives, as there was a lot of also, let's say, autobiographical narration, which I think is very interesting, that in relation to the more overarching topic, that we also answer this with biographies, and not with generalizations as such.
I'll say I mean, when you're talking about marginalized histories, I think for me, having grown up with, I mentioned Gerard Sekoto, George Hallett as well, and it was a time where I didn't think about I didn't think that I would work in the arts, so I sort of grew up with this environment. But for me, it wasn't like a marginalized culture. I mean, we were within that. So, I mean, we were marginalized in terms of cultural institutions, but that's something that was, like to me, it wasn't, actually, I learned a lot, even before studying history of art. So, it's interesting and like almost contrasted sort of approach, because I try to proceed from I try to position my center within the diaspora culture. And the other thing you were talking about the autobiographical approach to a curatorial. It's I can't remember what the exact. I mean, the question was so long; it's difficult to like.
I found it quite intriguing that that you start with that you kind of bring in your own biographical narration in relation to your work, and why you have a certain motivation, or why you have like a certain how to say. I forgot the word. Anyway, but so that this becomes, it is a kind of a politicization of a biography through the work. And I found this a very interesting motif in our times. So because it kind of goes beyond generalization. So a curatorial is this, and it's political art, we all show political art, so okay, what does it mean? And a little bit I felt this conference questioned this impetus. So, and I felt maybe this step aside is to look on ourselves from a side.
Yeah. I'll continue, but I think for me, what I was saying in the presentation as well is that I have the feeling that I've been doing the same thing all along. So it's actually something that I was. I mean, curating came after. I mean, I studied history of art. I studied in the 90s, so like in those days, you didn't have like the curator. So it's I've been. It's not that I decided to like investigate this history curatorially. It's just like it was just part of my research in history of art, and it just continued from that. And also one thing that I didn't have time to say was that this sort of autobiographical is also something that I'm coming back to in terms of like my investigation into sound art now, because I'm seeing it as a what was interesting actually yesterday in terms of the conversation around sound and language. I'm actually and decolonial approach to our practices, that I'm actually interested in the my own culture as a Cameroonian, and like we could see music, which is the music I grew up with, and how this is linked to Ewondo language, which is my mom's language, and I'm interested in that without having really intellectualized or politicized it as a decolonial approach. But for me it's more like a personal narrative. So it's always like remain a sort of personal narrative and investigation, but somehow it falls within or it falls under decolonial approaches and like investigation of archive and etc.
Well, you were sitting right next to me, so okay. Let's see. I'll just comment on the issue of history and the sort of politicization of autobiography, and then maybe leave the open up when we make some more general comments on international practice and how artworks enter that space. I think that the question of history is I mean, it's one that I'm obsessed with, and a lot of the artists whose work I'm familiar with, or a lot of the curatorial projects that I'm interested in doing. Obviously, it's a way to explore that, but this recovering, what you sort of describe as a recovering of history, or the urgency that comes from history, and it really does come out of the situation of of this colonial past that we kind of share, and of this post-apartheid past. Because we were always there, our kind of ancestors and forebearers and foremothers and so on were always there at the same time. But the history that in terms of the history with the capital H, and the history that is written is always the history of the powerful, and you all know this. But at the same time, it's sort of just uncovering what is and has been there. And I think it's also as a way to understand, how the entanglements and, the consequences and, the explanations for things. But really just to there's so much there to still uncover and unearth, because the history with the capital H kind of eclipses so much, and the same is true for national histories, or the history of modernism in different places too. That these are such broad kind of categories, and that even within the local context, there's that very strong impulse and urgency to uncover marginal histories, and to represent that some way. I think that I would say that bringing in the autobiographical for me was a way to also speak about a politic, less about my life story, which I'm happy to talk kind of off to the sides with people about, but really to use it, to mobilize it, to express a politic. And I think that curators, often we infer curators' politics from the shows they do, the arts they work with, the things that they write, but curators don't often state their politic, and put their politic at the forefront of their work. Some, yes, and we can kind of think of a few, and we can name those few, but for the most part, I feel at least that there's a sort of, there is a kind of holding back of what that politic is, and one's politic is formed in the autobiographical and the political and the personal and that sort of intersection. So, so I'll just, stop there. And would anybody else like to have this microphone or one of those?
Yeah. Okay.
It's kind of game, so everybody gets the pen and has to say how they feel.
It's like a sequence, no? But anyway, I'm struck, Sophie, by the terms that you set up, the terms international practice and marginalized history. And as an art historian, I try to overcome or surmount the binarism of international practice on the one hand and marginalized history on the other by treating or regarding the Philippines as a source of my material, largely, as some kind of an extensive locality. That term I like very much. An extensive locality that has its own density or thickness that mediates whatever is outside or perceived to be as foreign or external. So, and sometimes the global can be very thin in relation to the thick local. So I invest so much in that kind of extensive locality. And in relation to the politics of the biography shaping practice, I would like to say that I'm a trained art historian. So my approach to art, whether modern or contemporary, has been shaped by that kind of training partly from the West, of course mediated by the locality. But this thinking of the history of art always brings me back to colonialism, the very condition that introduced this category of art. So I try to stay away from art as the foundational moment of creative practice. That's why I focus on image, because image might slip through the burdens of or the demands of autonomy or self-consciousness, and can, I think, more nimbly move between registers, like between registers of art purely, but also of animism or even cloning. So that, I think, so that's why I'm quite invested in this idea of the image as a way to think through the history of art, and also the discipline of art history that had shaped me.
From a Hong Kong's perspective, I feel like we were quite always regarded in quite a marginal position. It's a lot of like through the system or education or institutional system, we pretty much adopt a Western system, pretty much from the previous colonial influence from Britain. But somehow in our education or the training system, we have different resources or nutrition from traditional Chinese as well. So it's quite a mixed place that sometimes I feel like when people talk about whether there is a strong identity or references of our local history that we can go back to, I feel like it's very mixed, and it is not just coming from a very simple sources, and it's very diverse. So a lot of time when we talk about like the history of Hong Kong, or what is our subject matter, what is Hong Kong art look like, or that kind of question, we got to ask quite a lot. But probably we just don't have one. And in our history, it always involves things, references to different important international events and incidences, and it will have an impact either in policy, in economy, and this is an overall impact to Hong Kong. So I see a complexity inside it. Yeah.
Yes, like countdown situation. Yeah. Following on Guo Ying, actually the questions about actually why we keep revisiting our own history in our own region. I think as a Chinese practitioner, I have my own anxiety first. Of course, because I found out there was there's kind of a similarity between this ideological practice and the artistic practice, in a way. Like what I talk about in my presentation, there's this indulgence of artistic language, interwoven with the market prosperity and the art system booming. So I feel, intuitively, I feel like there must be something unique here, in this kind of situation. I really want to find out what is that this uniqueness is, and I don't want to somehow compare this with this global context, because I know in China, global context is more about actually how to make yourself be more circulated in the global world. But it is, do we really, or are we really connected to the global context? ? And also, do we really have the infrastructure to be connected with the global world? ? So I think this urgency to revisit the history is actually to somehow discover this inner logic in the local history, but also somehow to be more open up in a conscious way, because the globalization was something that is given to us. It is not something that you develop from inside. So also I noticed there's also kind of a gentrification of history in the Chinese in this short Chinese art history of almost 4 decades. So art was, it's usually described as a dissident to the politics, and there's a kind of a breakaway, a sudden breakaway with the political history after the 1976. So that makes you wonder, because history doesn't function that way, right? There's no breakaway from anything. This is always a continuation of something. Maybe this something, this kind of a social or cultural logic has been buried in a way, in the new context of the economic reform, of the open up the own door. But still, we are not, how should I say? We are not we don't see ourselves in a context where the rupture plays a role. Actually, it is the exact context where the continuation plays a role. Even though this political air somehow drifted away in our current situation in the 90s, in the early 2000s, but then what you see here after 2012, you see all came back. It all came back. And I cannot define in a very academic way why this coming back makes sense in my curatorial practice. But I can see that I share this perception with many of my colleagues. The identity problem, the identity issue, where we come from, still, it's an issue that that matters. I don't see this issue, not like the other speakers here. It is an issue much more related to the colonialization. It is more an issue of this kind of obscure or arrogance.
Could we also say, because I think it's a very interesting point, which came also up in the other discussion, this question of identity. But there is, and that's probably the time we're living in, the question of identity. And there are 2 answers, and that is maybe also coming a bit when I take this intensified localities. So does it become reactionary? Does it become very local in the sense of exclusion? Or does it become, on the other side, inclusive? Does it allow to include others, other narratives, etc.? I think that's a bit where we are. We don't know. I mean, it depends. So in this respect, I would say, which is a kind of nice metaphor to talk about the image instead of art as like the artifact, the commodity, and then we have all these other discourses around us, but to believe in the critical approach of the image or the collateral damage it can produce. And then, but understanding at the same time the universalist approach, it's kind of going beyond the intensified locality, because I think that can go either way. So, but that is a little bit maybe where we are. I don't know if you agree, but that's maybe is a question we could share. You haven't said anything. No.
Good. I put the 2 issues together, identity and history, and I believe that they are together. But when it comes to history, I always feel like I work on different time scale. At the moment when we, especially in the art world, when we talk about history, always focus on last 50 years, 100 years, or like 200, it's like since the Industrial Revolution, or 500 years since the colonization. And then, but my time scale, I tend to work on different scale at the same time. I also want to look at the history that beyond 500 years. This 500 years is very important, of course, because most of our political values are actually formed in these 500 years. which we accept as universals, which is also by itself a big problem. You know, if we now want to talk about an identity issue, we also need to deal with what is, for example, this idea of republic, values, this idea of democracy. What is people? What about people beyond human? You know, are they people? You mean animals? You know, plants? Are they people? Or these issues? I think we need to also go into that part. And then I think this issue of what is politics and what are the basic political values, especially entrenched into already our constitution, which by itself also, basically identify we as a state person, a modern state person, as an individual. Even individual by itself is a question. When you hurt a tree as an individual is not hurt. Actually, it's a group of trees neighboring to it, are hurt, or they communicate about this so-called hurt and then react together. With this, animals also act the same way. So our idea of individual, in this sense, is very limited, and it is only very short time. It's only 500 years old, and in a lot of newly independent countries, this idea of individuality is even more strange. So this is my example. Because these issues are related: history, the time scale of history. Now we can talk about deep history, starting from the early human evolution. We can talk about big history, starting from the Big Bang, and all these. The time scale actually would bring us to different politics as well. So I want to, bring this issue back there. Even in, for example, when we talk about identity. It's an ethnic identity. And when you talk about ethnic, in what way am I ethnic? Or in what way am I national? I'm Taiwanese, and I'm talking here as part of the Global North member, and I'm an individual, and if I got killed, am I killed as a Global North, or am I killed as Taiwanese, or as a Chinese? And the Chinese government will not protect me, but Taiwanese government will protect me, and whatever. And of course, Global North people, you would try to protect me, I guess. And so on. All these are the new, our concept of how we are related. This kind of relatedness has changed if we look at history in a different time scale. And if we also expand that history, we would also expand our concept of politics and our basic political values. That's my response.
Any other responses from the podium before we open to the floor? Because I still think it's a valid question about thinking about exclusive and inclusive moment of the image, because I do think that that is not that clear when we're talking about identity politics, and I do think as much as it is a very valued discussion, there's also a danger. I mean, if you look at the kind of political discussion around identity politics these days. So I do think, and that's maybe more also a question of the conference, how do we do that answer with our work, cultural work, artistic work, research work, and how it was both informed, or maybe informed by new discourses, which maybe are not so new if you look at ways back. So we think it's new, but it wasn't for other kind of, let's say, groups. So, yeah. But maybe if there are any urgent questions, let's see, there are many. Maybe you, sir? We need a microphone, no? We have so many.
So the question's not only just to the speakers on the stage, you can also open to the speakers from previous 2 days. We can connect to the plenary session as well.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, maybe identity politics is the wrong term, it's too loaded. and there's like search for truth, search for identity, all this kind of stuff. But actually, I find the term, the concept of belonging, appartenance in French, a lot more useful, because there's, you're finding a belonging, but you are also responsible and responsive to others in relationship to all other things. And I think that what we call indigenous knowledges are founded in that principle of relationship and relationality, responsibility between all things, human beings being a function of Earth-centered world, not a human-centered world. Just to maybe, I don't know, add to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to speak about the kind of Hegelian art history that sort of came to me while, and particular to that period, the 19th century, concepts of the individual as and how the individual is legitimized, how the individual is made. Hegelian art history often disregards work that refuses to conform to the monographic or the idea that an artist is not monolithic or outside of that. And I think one of the things that comes to me is to think of the I as a form of a subject that perhaps the Hegelian art history just, or a form of a subject beyond the Hegelian art history that kind of pervades contemporary art. An I that sort of speaks to the experiential, but also one that points to certain concrete images that form a network rather than something that is all consumed within a legitimate sort of I or a legitimate subject.
I think I would like to respond to that, because I think, like, in terms of my own approach, I think it's also important to challenge the, how can I say, we need to bear in mind that there are different kind of individuals engaging with art. So if we focus on the I and the image, I think we're also excluding people, who don't have access to sight. And in terms of, for instance, I'm becoming more and more interested in experience, like in sound and like in different sensory approaches to art. And I think we shouldn't, like, we need to be aware of, when we focus on the I and the image and this. I mean, we also need to challenge this, this sort of discourse.
So maybe my provocation might be quite tangential, but I would like to bring up maybe the question of the future. And there's been a lot of diagnosing of the present and the look back into the past. But and just to preface, like, I see this sort of looping temporalities as well. Like, the look towards the past contains a kernel of futurity that can be brought into organizing and stuff and whatnot. But I find the question of futurity slightly lacking in maybe this discussion, perhaps. Futurity in the sense of organizing what is ahead, whose futures, and especially if we are thinking about, like, our political moment and whether this future, whether we and what futures are before us and present to us. Yeah, just a provocation.
Is it a question or?
But is there anyone who wants to respond from the speakers? So I think, I kind of share this a little bit because I think that's what I mean. There's a lot of looking back into histories, also kind of in this kind, let's say, emancipatory moment in history. So, and I've had for a moment the feeling, so we look back in the belief that there might be this emancipatory moment in the future too, even though it's unknown to us. So that is something which also struck me. So I think it was a little bit there, so in the atmosphere, so to say. So I think it is a question, maybe also to your practice or those who spoke the other day. Katrin, you want to respond?
I think what you brought up is very important. This is something, the future disappear, the ability of imagination, the ability to look at the future or to imagine the future, somehow we lost also in the last decade, 15, 20 years. And it's coming back now. And I'm very happy that you bring it up. I think it comes back very strongly with the young generation. There are also artists suddenly addressing it again, often in a very dystopian way. But suddenly it's a topic again. And I think this is also why I'm very hopeful. Although I talked about disillusionment, but the disillusionment was connected to the end of the 90s. I really think this is now an urgent issue again. And I miss that also very much in curatorial work, I have to say. So this is also your task.
I think,
obviously.
I'd love to respond as well, because I think, it depends on which perspective you're coming from, and I think talking from my context in England and what I presented about Lubaina Himid and the fact that she kept this archive of the work that she did in the 80s. She did that with the prospect or the idea of the future and how, what you transmit to younger generation. And in fact, at the university, so I work at the University of Central Lancashire, we have this archive and we have a lot of young students coming to the archive, and particularly we've had a collective, black queer collective coming to our archive, composed of Eva Nifekoya and two other artists. I can't remember their names, but I think, I'm not going to talk about Afrofuturism, but in concrete terms, archiving is also thinking about the future. What do you give the future generation? And Lubaina, I think she's maybe 10, 15 years older than me, but we have this sort of a cross-generational conversation where she's talking to me about some of the artists that she's engaged with, and because I do more curatorial and I include those artists in my exhibitions. So I think, I wouldn't agree in saying that that this is not something that we have in mind, because we do have that in mind. And also, again, coming back to the sound, from a personal perspective, me looking at traditional African culture, African sounds, I'm actually interested in this music. I keep on talking about it all the time, but I'm very passionate about sound and the history of some of the percussive instruments that we use, and the connection between coding, African coding, and how these drums were used to transmit messages from one village to the other, and how you can relate that to coding, in the digital culture. Is something that, because I can't speak from the Asian context, but in the African context, we've had a lot of our history that was robbed to us. So we're basically looking back at it to do future project, and also think about what we're also giving to a younger generation. And for instance, I opened an exhibition on Friday just before coming to Hong Kong with women artists and sound art, and there are two artists in my exhibition, Madeleine Bida and Elsa Mbala. Elsa Mbala is the only sound artist in Cameroon, female sound artist in Cameroon. And for me, it was really interesting to see that those artists are looking at the same traditional cultures that I was, intuitively exploring, and for them to be in my exhibition is something that I'm also thinking, like when you were talking about supporting young artists, I'm also thinking about their career and the future. So yeah, just wanted to talk about that.
Okay, I think the future, for me, it's the same as history. It depends on the scale. And not only the scale in terms of time, also the scale in terms of the consciousness. In this sense, I would say, no matter how much archive we are building, it will be digitalized. And then it will be digitalized, and so the future will be AI. It will be all under artificial intelligence. And then it's not science, it's not sci-fi, and it's not like dystopic judgment. It has to do with how now we guide ourselves in relation to technology, especially the new technology, connected with capitalism, connected with something that is already beyond human control, and it is artificial intelligence. It is there, and then we have to ask ourselves, how do we connect ourselves? How do we relate ourselves to artificial intelligence? And I think this, if I want to really get a direct answer, to this, is of course it's still very abstract. But on the other hand, it is there, and then our archive is now being read, scanned, and analyzed, and being used by artificial intelligence. Our social welfare information, our basic income, our tax, and everything is it's there. So I don't know how to answer it in terms of art history right now on this scale.
Well, can I respond to that question? Actually, yeah, a better future. That has been pictured so many times in our own history in China. So I'm really, yeah. It's not a trauma, but still, that's what we have been we've been taught actually since several decades. So, I mean, this may be not the starting point of any exhibition practice, I think, because when you revisit the history, there are actually a inner contradiction actually embedded in this act. One thing is that to restore the historical context, to retell the compelling story again, which could be easily becoming an intellectual taste. But the other thing is actually to do something based on your own urgency, actually. So if you think about the future, you will never start over. So if you have to somehow really find out your own anxiety and urgency to see why you want to do that, because I think the post-internet generation, they would never do that. For them, the flatness of history is legitimated, and they want to protect its legitimacy. So if we cannot argue on this level, because it's all about the own individual context.
Sorry, I do want to follow up with the future AI question, especially in a special day when there was an article published in Nature, the newly updated version of Go player called AlphaGo Zero beated the previously invincible AlphaGo by 100 versus 0. So yes, but anyhow, I'm bringing in a new topic, which is actually not new, the major theme of our international conference, the social role of art, and raise this question specifically to two speakers, Su Wei and Guo Ying, who come from mainland and Hong Kong. We all know there's this one country and two system policy in China, and I sort of sense there's this two system in your respective approach to art. In Su Wei's practice, you emphasize a lot of you put a lot of emphasis on metaphor, and through metaphors you look into history, and especially in those harsh political environments, say during the Sino-Japanese War and during the Cultural Revolution, how artists use metaphors to express their political intentions or probably social hopes. Whereas in Guo Ying's discussions and presentations today, we sense a lot of explicitly political expressions, sometimes so explicit that actually reminds me of some propaganda art. So I think, and I want to quote from the introductory text from two of your presentations where Guo Ying said, artistic practices of all kinds are very much a part of the fabric of our society, and art continues to be inspirational, to carry strong messages, and to have the ability to resonate with large audiences. Whereas Su Wei said, art and politics developed a mutually metaphorical relationship in certain political moments where neither the individual nor the art is directly affected by politics, nor are they a means of escape. So I think that the best way to ask my question is how Guo Ying considers Su Wei's practice and how Su Wei considers Guo Ying's practice. Thank you.
Well, if you need some time
and
to
Tiange is, by the way,
it.
our museum colleague.
Yeah, well, I was going to respond to the question of futurism, but I think I can give you guys some time to think about how to critically reflect on each other's practice. I was inspired by your question because I think even though I'm a very passionate fan of science fiction and gaming, I don't think the future is quite as speculative as we think, because especially today and at this conference, I was inspired by Patrick's badass presentation. We have concrete examples of art historians looking rigorously and reinventing methods of looking and technologies of interrogating the relationships, and really looking closely and intelligently at this extensive locality that are going against a lot of the curatorial trends that plague a lot of the big institutions. And I think when we think about politics, they tend to be very abstract and big, but often we forget that we have to deal with the politics within the art world. And when we talk about post-internet and all of these emerging discourses, we still have institutions paying handsome amount of money to curators who are too busy to look closely at the materials at hand, but because they work at hip institutions in major cities, they're invited to look at young Chinese artists who work with materials that they have zero knowledge of. And I'm being very explicit here, but the presentations today and the kind of openness but nuanced discussions today gave me hope that as long as we continue this kind of good work, we will render those undesirable practices and institutionalizations obsolete in that process. Thank you.
I want to have another question, just maybe one step further than Tiange's, also about the art as political engagement, but not specifically in Hong Kong or maybe globally. So so Ing talked about so some artists directly do with the current issue and some other indirectly, and also the rise of public participation and collective art making during the umbrella movement, while the art student taking up the responsibility, and most of the artists decided to be the protest participant instead of art maker, because they didn't. Part of the reason is they didn't want to be sad as taking advantage of the incident, like in Cantonese we say 操守. They want to avoid this possibility of being talked as that way. So I just wonder, so when some of the artists are doing very explicitly on our current issue, and so what do you think about that, and where is the line? I think this may happen in some other countries too. So I just wonder, what do you think about that?
Can I? Let me try to be as polite as possible. Liu Lei, I think you raised an important issue, but unfairly, in the sense that you need to situate both of them in their own context, right? Rather than abstract them out. And so I'm coming from a methodological, point of view. And so one issue is addressed to all of you or the organizer. And I think the whole panel shots through several layers. One is what I call methodological nationalism. None of you would claim to be nationalist, right? Except the another layer is the diasporic versus the whatever you call native or local, okay? And so there's a Pan-Africanism shots through, but then I don't want to say it's African nationalism, no. So what I'm bringing is a methodological issue right here, in the sense that it's our responsibility to interreferencing all the conversation going on here. And you know what I mean? So I want you to respond to that. And that's, how do you see this? In this, like Monray talked about Taiwan, even I agree with him with the long durée and all that, right? And so that's one, I think, critical issues, which the Inter-Asia Network has been confronting. That's why we say we need to know other places, right? That's one layer of the problem. The other issue is more political. And I actually get Monray involved. And Guoying and Su Wei, how you... Guoying's presentation is quite engaging, right, and moving. But I'm talking about the political events of the umbrella movement. And in Taiwan, it's the sunflower movement almost going on at the same time, right? And from my point of view, I think it's deeply problematic. Because the younger ones have no sense of history. In Taiwan, there was the earlier moment, and there is the June 4th student movement. There was, in Taiwan, is a Wild Lily movement, 野百合, right? And let me say this. Young ones pick up two notions, which is, coming from May 4th movement, right? 德先生, 赛先生, Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science, right? With no, I said the other day, people become judges. This is wrong. This is feudal. This is authoritarian, non-democratic, right? So Monray, I don't know how you read this is how the problem is decolonization. Taiwan and Hong Kong never decolonized, but China is responsible. I don't want to say Su Wei is no, it's not that. It is the mindset of Chinese intellectual indicating that we are never colonized. You people are colonized in Hong Kong and Taiwan, right? It's your problem. So I give the metaphor. If Taiwan is the hand, Hong Kong is the leg. You're part of the body. Are you part of it? They don't know how to respond. Right? They look down on those who are colonized. This is the Beijing mindset. And they say Shanghai people are colonized, they are concession, and so on, right? And so on. So I think I wrote this piece when we in Open Times, 开放时代. I charged Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy as a vehicle of liberalism towards imperialism. So these are the self-colonization and liberalism and imperialism are internally connected. We need to reopen those sacred moments, so-called May 4th movement, right? And one last question, tell me what is global? What do you mean? I know it's a thing. I've been arguing globalization geopolitically without moving through the third world become the same from our location, binary opposition between the West and us, wherever that us mean, right? So what do you mean by globalization? Or global, being global? It really beats me. People throwing all these conceptual terms, this is what I mean, 没有接地气啦, not on the ground. Right? So these are the points I hope not being too counterintuitive.
I feel like it's very difficult to directly answer because the issue itself is really complicated. It's not just the art being complicated, but all the incident or the reference I use, the situation, they have all their own identity. One of the floor question about art being propaganda or being used as a gimmick or promotional channel, but I kind of feel like art itself, it is one of its function. If you look at it in a wider sense, it was used to deliver message to kind of spread a belief, a story. So I think if artists really use it in this way, people who share the similar principle or attitude or belief with the artist, they will find it there is something they can references, they can share with the other. But somehow if it's not something that it click with you or it is reference, the proper reference to you, then it might not be the things that you find relevant. And I think that is what art for. The things, because it becomes so complicated, because we are not like, we are all individual, and especially nowadays, I was in another conference just 2 days ago that we said the era before the 80s, it seems like a we era. We receive our information and we learn about the world, about what's going on through the mass media. And that is pretty much a television, radio era. But now we receive information and from so many different channels. So it is become a me era now. So in this sense, can we really judge what is the motive or what is the intention of something with one single attitude? I think it's very difficult to judge that. But today in my presentation, I specifically choose a lot of really kind of demonstrative, visible example to illustrate how art can be worked nowadays through what they have been done. I didn't choose any work which is more inward-looking or more like a sharing piece of work. And it doesn't mean that they don't exist or they're not important, but I was just thinking if I want to focus on what art can do, that is one thing, is passing the message and give us a very clear visual memory about what the artist wants to say.
In relation to globalization, I would like to speak on behalf of 土地公, the land god. The land god is very localized. And it is, I think, it's also in the West also, even in the Christian world, you have this pagan tradition, which is so resistant to Christian power and big church and so on. But then people still go to the village, some corner of the village and do their own pagan worship to the land and to the environment. And so in the big Chinese or even Austronesian tradition, there is this 土地公, which is actually related to the village. A small scale in this sense is also important. Small scale of maybe 30, 50 families, and then you have 土地公 on different corners of your village, and then whenever you during holidays, you will go, according to the whole seasonal change, you go worship the 土地公, the land god. The land god is very situated, very located. It is different from the earth, the big god called Gaia, or it's different from globe. Yeah. So this 土地公 actually is so related to what we know as people who still live. And of course, in the sense of a modern education, we are excluded. most of us don't go worship Tudigong and don't feel the same way people who live locally who are so related to Tudigong. And this is the issue that I want to bring about when we talk about, for example, multitude. Multitude, are the people who still have Tudigong, who still think that their life are related to their locations. The location is not only about an address or their political ID and so on, but also related to the very local environment, which can be a city, a small part of the city, some street corners, or in the nature. Then you will be some villages and so on. And I think it's a situation where that also for us, I think. For me, I have researched in this for a while, and then I also realized that when we talk about how modern art try to search for its own spirituality, and how secularized and modern art is, and museums and art centers trying to replace the sacred space. And at the same time, outside there is still big church, the big religion renaissance at the moment happening everywhere. But then on the local level, you still have these folk religions going on in many parts of the world. You can see it. And once you get out of the big institution, you see this very localized gods. And I think this is a part of our a problem of our modernity. No, it's not global in the sense of globalization. Yeah, global because of that, human deep history. We are related to the land, to the environment. Yeah, and that's why we have all these connectedness to the local environment.
Can I mean, as much. Spirituality is one question, I think, but the other one, belonging to the land, again, that has two sides. I mean, if you look back in German history, belonging to land and to the Nazis, so the forest was German. Whatever it means to have a forest that is national, we don't know, but of course it was intended. So if we look at a landscape painting with a German forest, it is very nationalistic. So I don't know if belonging to the land is that kind of, how do you say, unschuldig, innocent, as you describe it now. I'm sorry, but I know it's a modern argument, but still I think it's not, we kind of try to also maybe to tend these kinds of, in these spiritual arguments, to a little bit overlook that there are also histories we cannot go back beyond, and they also have their right to be discussed within these broader questions.
Let me add this. Even for example, I live in Germany for a while, and also in Austria. If you go to the countryside, you still see people worship, make small altars in the woods, and on the mountainside by the water, on some rocks, and then they call it Maria something. They worship there. It's like a pagans. Pagans survive. And it's still there, even though, I don't know, I mean, okay, the whole modernity try to suppress that, from this history, of modernity. It's even in our textbook, you have to read that, it's all superstition, don't believe that, science is against that, But on the other hand, this whole pagan, I don't call it pagan because that's part of my life, it survived.
Yeah, I think I should respond to that question, right? I like Guoying, actually. One of my best friends in Hong Kong, so. But I think your question somehow, refers to the judgment, a kind of potential judgment I should have made, in confrontation or in regarding to Hong Kong, to the political circumstance and also the politically engaged art. But the problem is that I don't want to judge. That's the problem. So you want to get to know more about them, you come to Hong Kong. Be with them, sit down with them in the umbrella movement. Be active, This is a kind of a subjective manner, actually. Be active. You know, sometimes, I think I can give you another example. Last year at Video Touch, Phoebe and I, we co-curated this show, retrospective show of the Video Touch. And it was actually, I was told actually it should be a show about the media history in Hong Kong. And then I did my research, and at the beginning of my research, I really found out material documentation that all somehow related to that media history, if that media history started from the early 80s to the 2000s. And then I got a bit suspicious, because I think this is kind of like what I just said, gentrification of history. This is just one mode of thinking, one elite mode of thinking that really endanger everything, actually. If we look at the umbrella movement, is there any media applied in it? This is the umbrella movement itself, the best exhibition in the world at the moment. So I think, I as a mainland curator, I curated this show with Phoebe, a local Hong Konger, and with a local collaborated with a local Hong Kong institution. So I came here, I approached, somehow I appropriated the methodologies I developed in mainland China, and somehow tried to do an experiment here to see if that's possible to create this kind of an interrelation or kind of intersubjective context. And really, also I found out there were similarities, there were dialogues, there were lots of parallels that we can somehow put on the table to discuss. So I think it's really simple. This is a subjective matter. You go out of your zone and feel it.
Just for follow up, it's not my intention to to engage both of you into political argument. Actually, my question is still like centering around art, or probably put it into a simplistic way, like should art distance itself a bit from the politics, and if so, like how long the distance should be? Or is it like totally like equal? I mean, the reason why I quote like Sino-Japanese War and Cultural Revolution and propaganda art is that Hong Kong is definitely a very harsh political environment, but which actually mainland China has also experienced back then. And you see this during say the harsh political environment in mainland China. There are artworks produced for political purposes, and there's also art for in a metaphorical way to express their intentions. So I mean, as curators, how do you pick up works from those artworks, the whole artworks that was made during harsh political environment, especially in these kind of environment? Do we choose like explicitly political artworks or sort of metaphorically political artworks? Is there any, that's basically it's an artistic question, not political question.
I can't answer for the Asian context, but I think we need to distinguish between, in your question, you said, should art distance itself from the politics? And you need to distinguish between politics and power. I think artists have the prerogative to choose whatever topics and like kind of approach they want to have. But there's a distinction between politics and power. I think art should distance itself from power, but I don't think it should distance itself from politics. But at the same time, I think that artists, should feel free to explore politics either in a sort of a overt way or in a more subtle or conceptual way. That's my.
Maybe it's more a question about how we call this, because I think there is a distinction between the political and politics. And I think what you mean is politics in the sense of real politics and the everyday, how it's been operated by governments or whatsoever, and the political as a kind of space of imagination. And I think that is like as a condition maybe also when we look into art history and how we're reading art or images, and that is not something you can distance yourself because you're in it. I don't think that you really can go out of that because you're both inside and outside. So, but that's maybe also a difference than how we would think of the politics and the political.
I'm sure what I wanted to say was answered by Christine, because you must also look at curators as visual DJs. They play certain songs at a certain time. And at the end of the day, like what Christine said, you can't separate art from politics. But I'm sure it's a game we play as curators. Because remember, art is there to educate. Art is there to communicate. And even in the past, way back, art was always there to communicate messages from one generation to another. And also looking back to what others were talking about in terms of globalization and what Prof was saying, and from what Man Ray was saying, which I wanted to correct him to say, don't call cultures pagan, because you continuing a colonial agenda and a colonial project where other cultures were called pagan and their cultures were called civilized cultures. So I'm glad that you were able to correct that, because it's important for us to keep on reminding ourselves not to perpetuate colonial terminologies that have been in existence and marginalizing people's cultures. So it is very important for us as people to, as much as we look into the future, but we need to understand that history plays an important role of who we are today. And so there's need for us to question some of the intentions by, the so-called, like he was talking about the history, with a big H, which Natasha was talking about. But I mean, I'm sure it's like Asia and Africa and other colonized world, we share the same kind of history, because we share, for us as British colonies, we share the same colonizers. And that's what informs our thinking as curators, as artists, as historians, as, like my colleague from Philippines. I mean, I really loved the presentation because I thought it was actually bringing other aspects of the histories which we didn't understand, because we are always looking from a distance. And that's why this conference is very important for us to be able to interrogate these issues.
Maybe I'll just add one more comment to Yang's question, because I think you're asking something on a very simple and fundamental and basic level too, which is, and there's some interesting comparative situations for what you're asking. It's not only, in the Chinese example, but in Eastern Europe as well, after the fall, and rethinking art history and artworks and museum collections and exhibitions, as well as in South Africa, where, there was also huge debates in the 80s about, art for the struggle and artists for the struggle and propaganda art and, fine art. And it's very complicated and messy, and people were fighting about this, But with time, and the having the value of time to look at that material again, and then to work with that material and to figure that out. But it's not it's not unprecedented, and there's a lot of or some really amazing propaganda art by today very well-known artists, and there's some really all kinds of other art as well. But that is like a process, of art historical work, of curatorial work to kind of sort through those really large, messy and complex situations. And one can curate shows from that material in different kinds of ways. In South Africa, there's an archive at a university for all the kind of visual culture that the cultural movement produced, you know, and artists were involved, and just local people and workers, and everybody was involved in some way in that. And then there's also, you know, I like your presentation because it reminded me so much of that kind of moment, you know, when there's a political movement, a political moment, and a kind of cultural mobilization around it. But you also have, you know, so-called individual artists, you know, fine artists, who also create works in response to that, you know, and you have others who don't. I mean, there's everything in between, who, you know, kind of just sit it out or go about their business or whatever it is. So I think it's a question that can be asked of many different contexts that have had this, and there's a vast literature on how that process of sorting out and, you know, acknowledging and showing has happened in other places.
Yes, I think on this note, we will end. So yes, we wanted to thank all of you, the speakers of the day and the speakers of the conference, and to all of you who stayed here with us, and all of you who watched the conference online. And the workshop with the participants continues for 2 more days, so there's a lot of intensive follow-ups and discussions, and I think a lot of the digestion of many things that were discussed here will occur over the next couple of days. And yeah, we just want to thank again also our host at Asia Society, as gracious as ever, and also the other sponsors, the SH Ho Foundation, who has really made this event possible. And to invite you all to also visit Parasite and to see the current show. And also there's some books available for sale over there, so why don't you have a look on your way out. So thank you to all of you. Thank you.